The train wasn't on the schedule. It screamed into the station, the metal wheels shrieking against the rails as sparks flew in bursts of orange light. The platform vibrated underfoot, and the stale air smelled of burning steel. The doors slid open, and cold air rushed out. Sharp, unnatural, like stepping into a shroud jaw. Yet so perfect, it had to be part of a contribution. Freezer. The carriages were empty. At least, that's how they looked at first. Stepping closer, the shadows inside the train shifted. Not from the flickering overhead lights, but from something moving. Slowly, deliberately. It wasn't a person. The shape was too tall, its limbs too long, its head tilting unnaturally as it turned toward the eatstees doorway. The platform lights flickered once, then again. A sound like wet footsteps echoed from inside the train. Then, a voice. Low and guttural, almost human but not quite. Come closer. The air grew heavier, colder, wrapping around the chest like a vice. Every instinct screamed to back away, to run. The voice spoke again, louder this time, coming from somewhere impossibly close. He broke the rule. The doors slammed shut and the train began to move, its windows darkening, but the figure inside didn't stay on board. It was on the platform now, and it was watching. The station stretched out in eerie silence, its once familiar hum feeling almost too deliberate. Loose sign, the occasional rumble of unseen machinery. It felt alive, more than just metal and concrete. Something deeper, watching, waiting. The first walk through the platforms revealed nothing out of place, but the air felt heavier. In certain pockets, dense with an unplaceable chill. The corners of the station seemed darker than they should have been, as if the light refused to touch them. Out of the corner of the eye, shadows moved, not fast, but deliberate, like something retreating. Just before being noticed, then the intercom crackled. Static burst through the speakers, harsh and uneven, breaking the stillness like a jolt of electricity. No announcement followed, but the static didn't stop. It shifted, fluctuating in tone, almost forming words before cutting out completely. The silence that followed was suffocating. On the second platform, a faint rush of air announced the arrival of a train. The hum of the schedule had been memorized. There were no trains due at this hour. The rumble of wheels on the tracks grew louder, almost angry, and then the train emerged. The carriages were unlike the earlier ones. The windows were fogged, and faint shapes pressed against the glass, smudging it from the inside. The train stopped with a jarring screech, the sound echoing unnaturally in the emptiness. The doors opened. Inside was nothing but dim light and the faint smell of wet earth, sharp and metallic. A soft sound followed, a rhythmic, wet dragging, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. The rules came to mind. Never approach a train that isn't on the schedule. The platform felt colder, the air tightening as the second stretched. The doors remained open, almost inviting, until a soft exhale echoed from within the train, low and guttural. A step back broke the spell, and the train reacted instantly. Its doors snapped shut, the movement impossibly fast. It screeched away from the platform, its lights flickering erratically as it disappeared into the tunnel. The station settled into silence again, but something had shifted. The faintest whisper floated from the darkness of the tunnel, carrying a single word, a name. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and too familiar. It wasn't just a voice. It was their voice, coming closer, almost pleading. The rules resurfaced, sharp and clear. If you hear someone calling your name from the tunnels, do not answer. Turning away, the walk back to the concourse became a run, but the whisper didn't. Fade it followed, close enough to feel the cold breath of its words. The concourse lights flickered once, briefly illuminating something standing just beyond. The edge of the platform, something watching. The air felt heavier as the station seemed to shift, the atmosphere growing colder and quieter. The distant hum of machinery faded into an almost oppressive stillness. Returning to the platform brought no relief. It felt different now, larger, as if the shadows had carved out new spaces where none existed before. A sound broke the silence, shuffling footsteps on the far end of the platform. Turning, the figure came into view, someone who shouldn't have been there. The person moved slowly, their steps uneven, dragging slightly. Their clothing was strange, faded and covered in faint soot, like something from another time. They stopped in the middle of the platform and turned, their face obscured by the shadows, cast by the dim overhead lights. "Which way's the exit?" the voice rasped, barely more than a whisper. The question was simple, but it clung to the air like a weight, its tone too hollow, too distant. The rules came to mind. Do not engage with the ones who ask for directions. Stepping back instinctively, the air thickened further, pressing down with an almost physical force. The platform. "Is it still here?" they asked again, their voice rising slightly. The words, historically. Before an answer could come, the figure jerked suddenly, their body twisting as though gripped by unseen hands. Their face turned fully now, pale and unblinking, their eyes hollow pits of dark void. A faint sound, almost a growl, came from deep within the Minhara, shadows around them. Then they bolted, running toward the escalators at the far end of the station. The escalators were still, but as the figure reached them, they groaned to life, the steps, shifting direction to pull downward. The figure stepped on without hesitation, disappearing into a darkness that seemed deeper than the tunnels themselves. The escalator stopped abruptly, leaving silence behind. The control room felt like the only safe place. Inside, an old logbook sat on the desk, dusty but untouched. Flipping through its pages, the entries grew more erratic. Saw the shadow again near platform 3. A passenger stepped onto the escalators, but never came back. Do not acknowledge the ones who ask for directions. The final entry, written in shaking handwriting, stopped the breath short. "It's watching, don't break the rules." The intercom crackled to life suddenly, a soft, static-filled whisper that filled the room. A voice, faint but clear, said one word: "Run." The station was unbearably quiet, as if the building itself had drawn a deep breath and was holding it. But the weight of the night pressed harder. Then the lights flickered. Twice. The fluorescent hum faltered, leaving the station in near darkness for a heartbeat too long. The rules surfaced instantly. Hold your breath until the lights stabilize. The chest tightened as lungs emptied, and the first flicker of light returned, weak and trembling. In the dim glow, something stood on the opposite platform. Figures. Their outlines were impossible. Tall, unnaturally thin, their limbs too long and bent at jagged angles. Their heads tilted, faces blank, except for the dark hollows where eyes should have been. They didn't move, but their presence was suffocating, as though they drew the air out of the space. The lights dimmed again. In the brief darkness, the faint sound of something dragging across the ground echoed, low and deliberate. Their positions had shifted, their hollow gazes fixed, unwaveringly. The station trembled faintly, as if the floor was reacting to their presence. Burned now, the ache of held breath clawing for release. The figures twitched. It wasn't movement in the traditional sense, just a sharp tilt of their heads, an unnatural bend of their arms. Their hollow eyes seemed to widen, and the dragging sound grew, louder, closer, though they remained in place. My, echo! The lights flickered again. This time they stayed off longer. The darkness was absolute, heavy and alive, wrapping around every surface like a suffocating shroud. The dragging stopped, replaced by the silence so deep it felt tangible. The lights returned with a hum, bright and piercing. The figures were gone. The platform was empty, but the air hadn't lightened. The dragging sound began again, faint now, coming from deep within the tunnels. The logbook sat on the control room desk, left open to an unfamiliar page. The Santa Clara handwriting was frantic, scrawled across the margins. If you see them, do not run. They chase, movement. The note ended there, but the faint outline of another sentence, erased and smudged, was still visible beneath. And if they catch you? The sentence trailed off into a jagged scratch. The intercom crackled, bursting into static that seemed to pulse in time with the light. Then, through the distortion, came a single, broken word. Stay. The clock struck 3 a.m. and the air shifted. The station's hum deepened, a low, vibration that resonated through the walls and floor. The ticket booth door locked with a deliberate click, sealing the small space in artificial safety. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a cold, sterile glow that barely pushed back the shadows. The booth's glass windows distorted the view of the Sicilier concourse. It was warping. Then came the first tap. A single knock on the glass, sharp and precise. It echoed louder than it should have, cutting through the heavy silence. The knock came again, rhythmic now, each sound deliberate. From the corner of an eye, a shape appeared beyond the booth. Its outline was indistinct, blurred by the glare of the lights, but it stood motionless, its presence pressing against the glass. The knocking stopped. A voice followed, low and wet like it was spoken through water. "You forgot me." The words sent a shiver through the spine. Breath hitched, and instinct fought against every urge to look directly at the figure. The rules screamed silently. Stay in the booth. Do not open the door. The glass rattled as the knocking turned into pounding, each strike reverberating through the booth. The door handle jiggled violently, as though someone, or something, was trying to force its way in. The pounding stopped suddenly. The silence that followed was worse, suffocating and thick. Then came a faint scratching, like nails dragging against the floor. The sound started at the base of the door, slow and deliberate, circling the booth. It stopped at the corner nearest the desk, and something pressed against the glass, leaving a fogged imprint that stretched too wide. The rules sheet caught the eye. It had changed. The ink was fresh, glistening in the dim light, and a new line had appeared at the bottom. If they ask for help, you can't refuse. A new sound rose, a faint whisper, echoing within the booth. The glass distorted. Further, shapes pressing closer, blurring the boundaries between the inside and outside. The scratching grew louder, and the booth trembled, as though the station itself was pushing against it. The voice returned, clearer this time, just outside the door. "Let me in." The clock hands trembled, and for a moment, they stopped moving entirely, and the booth door unlocked itself with a soft click. The clock ticked toward 4 a.m., each second dragging, as though time itself fought against moving forward. The booth remained locked, but the air inside was oppressive. Silent grief washed over me as I stood behind the bar bearer. The last few hours my promise had been taken from me, thick with an unshakable dread. The glass warped further, the shadows outside, stretching unnaturally, their movements deliberate and unnerving. Then, the faint hum of an approaching train shattered the silence. The sound grew louder, rhythmic and steady, unlike the screeching, irregular noises of the others. The platform trembled slightly, a gentle vibration that carried a strange warmth. The lights above the tracks flickered, but remained steady, casting a soft glow. As the train emerged from the tunnel, it looked different. The carriages were pristine, their lights unwavering, the windows clear. The train seemed impossibly normal, an anchor of logic in the chaotic nightmare that had consumed the station. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, and the faint smell of warm air and clean steel wafted through the platform. The intercom crackled to life, a calm, steady voice cutting through the tension. "It's time to leave." The words echoed with an unsettling certainty, spoken as if they were meant only for Krecha. Those who had survived the night, inside the booth, the scratching at the door intensified, nails or claws raking the metal surface, accompanied by faint whispers, edges of the booth's frame. The rules flashed through memory, their authority feeling distant now. Never board an unscheduled train, but another line surfaced, buried in the logbook's final pages. "Some trains are safe. You'll know when it's time." The glass trembled as something slammed against it, the force cracking its surface. The press sheath, scratching at the door, turned frantic, and beneath it, a thick, inky shadow began to seep, and spreading across the floor like an oil spill. There was no time left. The platform called with its steady light and the waiting train, but the safety of the booth, cracked as it was, still offered familiarity. The intercom voice repeated, quieter now, almost a whisper, "It's time to leave." The door burst open. The air behind it was wrong, colder and darker than the shadows that spilled forward. A decision was made on instinct, and the booth was abandoned as footsteps pounded toward the waiting train. The doors slid closed, just as the shadow surged onto the platform. The train pulled, Away and through the rear window, the station shrank into the distance, the shadows, retreating into the darkness. But the train's lights flickered once, and the destination sign remained blank. The train sped through the tunnels, but the windows showed nothing, only endless blackness, too dense to be a lack of light. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels felt unsteady, like the train wasn't on tracks at all. The interior lights flickered, faint and sickly, casting strange shadows on the walls. The air inside felt wrong. It was heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang that left an unnatural taste on the tongue. The doors rattled lightly, though there was no motion to cause it, and the soft hum of the train's engine grew distorted, morphing into faint whispers. Then the train emerged from the tunnel. Daylight spilled in through the windows, but it wasn't right. The city outside looked familiar but warped. Buildings stretched to impossible heights, their reflections in the glassy streets twisting unnaturally. There were no people, no movement, only a stillness. It felt alive. The train slowed, its brakes hissing softly, and stopped at a station that looked identical to the one left behind. End of the line. Next shift begins soon. The words sent a chill down the spine. The doors slid open, revealing an empty platform. The air outside was colder than it should have been, carrying the faint sound of footsteps in the distance. Stepping off the train, the platform felt eerily familiar, but something was wrong. The floor beneath didn't echo as it should. It absorbed sound like a sponge. A faint vibration ran through the ground, rhythmic and pulsing, as though something beneath the surface. I was alive. On a nearby bench sat a logbook. It was identical to the one from the control room, the same worn leather cover and a red X scrawled across its front. Breeze, revealing a single line of fresh handwriting. Welcome back. You know the rules. The clock above the platform ticked loudly, each second dragging like an accusation. The train's doors remained open, the warm light inside calling faintly, but the track ahead stretched into darkness once more. Behind, faint whispers echoed from the entrance to the station, soft at first, but growing, louder. They weren't distant anymore. They were close, just out of sight, overlapping in sound. A cacophony of voices that all spoke the same word. Stay. The logbook's pages shifted again, revealing another line in shaking text. You can't leave. You can only pass it on. If you dare, share this story. But be warned, every word strengthens the station's pull. Each retelling pulls it closer to the next traveler, the next unwary passenger. Are you sure your next train will take you home? Or is it already waiting to take the end? You somewhere you'll never escape? The lantern flickered, casting jagged shadows on the damp stone walls. A sharp scraping sound echoed behind, low and deliberate, like nails dragging against at the tunnel floor. Turning quickly, the beam of light caught nothing but empty darkness. Then came the whisper. It wasn't from the group up ahead. It was too close, curling just behind the ear. The voice was soft but unmistakable, familiar in the worst way. You shouldn't be here. The lantern flickered again, this time longer. The shadows on the walls moved, stretching unnaturally, shifting into shapes that shouldn't exist. The air turned cold, biting against the skin. Footsteps sounded from deeper in the tunnel, heavy and slow, approaching steadily. But the path ahead was clear. No one. I was there. The light dimmed further, and in the fading glow a figure emerged, tall and thin, its face a featureless void. It didn't move, but the shadows around it writhed like living things, reaching for the edges of the lantern's glow. The beam faltered, the darkness pressing closer. The scraping sound started again, now in every direction. The lantern blinked out completely, and something breathed from the blackness. You broke the rules. The lantern flickered out completely, plunging the tunnel into complete darkness. The sudden absence of light made the air feel heavier, colder, almost as though darkness was closing in around them. The last vestiges of light from the dimming lantern cast faint shadows on the walls, and the air grew thick, nearly suffocating. A harsh breath broke the silence. It wasn't their own. The sound was too close, just behind them, impossibly close. They froze, heart pounding in their chest. They turned, instinctively, but saw nothing. The empty tunnel. stretched endlessly in both directions, dark and silent, save for the muffled thud of their own heartbeat. A soft scraping sound filled the air, slow, deliberate, like fingers dragging across stone. The sound seemed to come from everywhere, vibrating in the walls, the ceiling, the very ground beneath them. It was inescapable. They swallowed, throat dry, and reached for the matches. Hands shaking, they fumbled with the box, the cold air making it harder to strike a match. Finally, it flared to life. The dim glow illuminated the walls, the shadows around them reaching as though alive. The scraping stopped, but the silence that followed wasn't any better. It was thick, oppressive, pressing in from all sides. They stared into the darkness, willing the light to hold, to push back whatever lurked just out of sight. Then the whisper came again, soft and barely audible. "Don't look back." The voice was wrong, too familiar and yet impossibly distant. It sent a chill running through them. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up, but they couldn't move. The tools from earlier, the ones they had ignored, flooded back into their mind. But I couldn't remember what they were supposed to do. A shadow flickered in the corner of their eye. They snapped their head toward it, but the light revealed nothing. Only the walls, covered in thick layers of damp grime. The shadow had been a trick of the dim glow, they told themselves. But the scrape of something moving, of something shifting just beyond the edge of their light was unmistakable. It was close again, moving closer, impossibly fast. The footsteps came next, slow but steady, echoing through the tunnel as if someone or something was walking toward them. The darkness felt like it was pressing against their chest, suffocating them. Each step echoed louder, clearer, a breath caught in their throat as they realized whatever was coming didn't need the light to see them. The whisper came again, this time directly behind them. "You've already looked back." The whisper from behind was followed by a cold breath on the back of their neck. They froze, unable to move, paralyzed by the realization that the darkness around them wasn't simply void, it was alive. The lantern's flickering glow illuminated only a small portion of the tunnel, the rest swallowed by an unyielding blackness that felt wrong. The scraping noise started again, louder this time, echoing against the stone walls as if something was dragging itself toward them. The sound grew sharper with each passing second, closer, closer. They wanted to turn, wanted to see what was behind them, but the weight of fear kept them in place. The rules, don't look back, stay with the light screamed in their mind, but it was too late. The darkness had already crept into their very bones. Every inch of the stone tunnel felt oppressive, closing in. The silence between the echoes was unbearable, thick with the absence of life. No footsteps, no sound of breath, just the scraping. The light from the lantern flickered once more, its small flame growing weak. As it dimmed, the shadows stretched, their forms contorting and shifting. For a brief moment, they could have sworn the darkness moved. It wasn't just a void. It was something else, something that had shape and purpose, and it was closing in on them. A desperate glance at the tunnel ahead revealed only more blackness, more emptiness. It was as though the path had disappeared. No way forward, no way back. They were trapped in a living abyss with no escape. Then came the whisper again, unmistakable, right next to their ear, this time with an almost mocking tone. "You're already lost." The breath that followed it was wet and rasping, the sound too unnatural to ignore. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything that should have been in the tunnels. The lantern sputtered violently, its flame flickering once, twice, before the light went out. Completely. Darkness fell around them like a blanket, pressing in on all sides. They could feel it now, not just see it. A presence, ancient and hungry, waiting. The scraping had stopped, but now there was something else, something closer. A shuffle of feet, the faintest rustle of fabric brushing against stone, and then a low, guttural sound. Too close, breathing. The air was so thick with fear it was suffocating. They fought the impulse to scream, to break the silence with the hope that someone, anyone, could hear. But the tunnel swallowed sound, leaving only the oppressive dark. Then, in the depths of the blackness, came a glint, a brief flash of light, cold and far too Pale, it was moving toward them. The whispers grew louder. "You're not meant to be here." Something was approaching, and it wasn't human. And it was almost upon them. The lantern's flame flickered weakly, casting an eerie, dim glow on the walls, but it was becoming harder to trust the light. The tunnel felt wrong. The path ahead seemed too long, stretching farther than it should have, and the familiar landmarks, twisted rock, formations, the usual jagged edges, were nowhere to be found. The group huddled together, but their collective uncertainty was palpable. Which had been their guide no longer seemed to make sense. Unexpectedly, and the walls no longer matched what was on the paper. The markings on the map shifted, almost like the tunnels themselves were changing, refusing to be understood. One of the tourists nervously remarked, "We must have gone the wrong way. This doesn't look like the last section we passed." But it wasn't just the paths that had shifted. The walls had changed. They were wider, now smoother. New carvings had appeared, deep gouges and symbols that weren't there before. Initials, written hastily, repeated again and again. The same strange, unsettling initials they had seen earlier etched into the stone as though the wall itself had been branded. Alongside them, a new phrase had been carved. "You can't leave unless it lets you." The words felt like a cold punch to the gut. Everyone froze, staring at the markings. A heavy silence settled over the group, broken only by the faint echo of dripping water. Somewhere in the distance, forward, as though they had been carved by something other than time, something that wanted them there. Without warning, the shadows at the edge of the lantern's light shifted. A figure, tall and possibly thin, stood at the periphery, barely visible but unmistakable. It didn't move, just stood there, growing darker the longer it was ignored. A tourist, wide-eyed and frantic, pointed at it. "What is that? What's that thing?" The words hung in the air like a spark in dry wood. The moment the figure was acknowledged, it vanished, swallowed by the darkness with no trace of its presence left behind. But the temperature dropped. The air grew colder, heavier. The space felt tighter, as though the very tunnel was shrinking around them. Then, the whispers started. Soft at first, like the wind, but quickly rising to something more distinct, more insistent. It tangled itself around me again. It wasn't a voice. It was a presence, something closer than it should have been. Laughing, low, quiet chuckles that seemed to come from all directions at once, reverberating off the walls. The light dimmed further. Panic set in. Two tourists, unable to bear the tension any, Alfred came in longer, sprinted down the tunnel ahead, disappearing into the darkness before the protagonist could even call out to stop them. Now, with only the remaining group behind them, the protagonist was alone in the silence, with only the creeping sound of laughter and the growing pressure of the shifting shadows around them. They were no longer certain of the path ahead. They didn't even know if the way out existed. The moment the two tourists reappeared, it was clear something was terribly wrong. Their faces were pale, sickly pale, drained of color, the kind of pallor one would expect from someone who hadn't seen the sun in far too long. Unblinking, fixed straight ahead, and they moved as though they were no longer fully in control of their bodies. The silence between them was suffocating. They didn't speak. Instead, they motioned for the group to follow, their arms stiff, movements too precise, too mechanical, trembled in the trembling hands of the guide, casting strange, twisting shadows on the walls, shadows that seemed to move, stretch, and reach out toward them. A brief flash of something in the corner of their vision, nothing more than a flicker, left them questioning whether it had really been there at all. The group hesitated, but followed. The unsettling silence deepened. The tunnel stretched on, the path impossibly long. The deeper they went, the more distorted the surroundings became, as if the very walls were warping, bending around them. The map, which had once been their guide, was useless now. The inked lines didn't match what they saw. The twists and turns didn't exist on paper. And then, the whispers started. Low at first, just hushed murmurs, almost drowned out by the sound of their footsteps but growing louder. A few of them murmured their worries aloud, eyes darting nervously from side to side, moving toward them, closing in. The flickering lantern didn't help, its light growing weaker with each step they took. The whispers turned accusing. They weren't just worried whispers anymore. They were angry, filled with blame. "It's your fault," one voice muttered, faint but distinct. We wouldn't be here if you hadn't led us down this way." The words cut through the air like knives, leaving a sting that lingered. The group turned on one another, eyes wide with suspicion, their paranoia spreading like wildfire. Was it the darkness making them speak, or something worse? Had something invaded them, changing who they were? And then it happened. The carvings on the wall, initials they had passed earlier, shifted. They became jagged, frantic, as if someone had desperately scratched them into the stone. Deep, erratic strokes. "Don't trust the light." The air became thick, suffocating. The guide's hand tightened around the lantern, but the flame sputtered out, and in a blink, everything went black. The darkness was absolute. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of ragged breathing, the smell of damp stone filling their lungs. Then came the laughter, low and hollow, a sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Something was out there, waiting. They weren't alone. The silence afterward was worse. The only thing left was the heavy weight of the unknown, the quiet that pressed in on them like the darkness itself had teeth. The lantern flickered back to life, its faint glow barely enough to cut through the darkness. Every direction. The faint light revealed nothing but empty air, but as their heart raced, every corner seemed to twist and stretch. They were alone. The others, who had been right there just moments ago, were gone. Gone. The stillness was crushing, suffocating. The whispers returned, soft at first, like distant echoes, but soon louder, more insistent. They circled, overlapping, as though coming from all directions at once. At first, they couldn't understand the words, but then, one social worker raised her hand, shouted 10 times, and then, voice pierced the cacophony. "You shouldn't have stayed." The light from the lantern trembled as they tried to make sense of their surroundings. The tunnel, which had seemed so familiar, had shifted. The walls, once jagged and uneven, now seemed smooth, stretching unnaturally, reaching into the distance. The sound of their own breath felt distorted, echoing off the walls in a way that made it sound wrong, too far away. Then, they saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, impossibly tall. It had no distinct features, just a vague outline, its shape absorbing the faint light, making the shadows deeper around. The figure didn't move, but its presence was undeniable, suffocating the air. It stood, perfectly still, its shape flickering in and out, like a mirage in the dark. The whispers grew louder, until they were all they could hear. The voice was deep, resonant, and it filled the entire tunnel. It wasn't just a voice. It was a presence. Something ancient, something wrong. They tried to move, to run, but their feet felt glued to the ground. Panic surged through them, but every step they took led them back to the same spot, to the same thing standing in the shadows. The path twisted, the tunnel itself rearranging, as if the very walls had conspired against them. The figure remained ahead, always just out of reach, moving in a way that shouldn't have been possible. No matter how fast they ran, the darkness closed in, and the figure followed. It was waiting, and the more they tried to escape, the tighter the grip of the tunnel became. There was no escape. The whispers turned into laughter, low and guttural, reverberating through the walls. The light from the lantern flickered once more, dimming until it threatened to go out. Completely, they were trapped. The darkness had taken hold, and the rules, those forgotten rules, had already been broken. They woke up in the same place they'd started, but everything was different. The world felt off, as if reality itself had bent and twisted, while they had been lost in the tunnels. The air was stale, thick with the smell of damp earth, but it didn't feel like they had just emerged from the depths. It felt like they had never left at all. The ground beneath them was solid, too solid. The tunnel's exit, which had been wide, open only hours ago, was now sealed shut. The sign read, "Closed for maintenance." A dizzying wave of confusion swept over them. How had they gotten back so quickly? Had it all been a nightmare? No. The darkness they had felt, the oppressive weight pressing against them, was too real. But now the world around them seemed oddly silent, far too quiet for a place that should have been bustling. Reaching into their pocket, they found something. A small, crumpled piece of paper. An advertisement from the city. It wasn't there before. The jagged handwriting, just like the notes they had seen on the fence walls of the tunnels. Read. The darkness let you go. This time. A cold shiver ran through them. It wasn't over. They weren't free. The surroundings around them felt wrong. Too still. Too quiet. They turned, and saw nothing but the empty path leading back to the surface. The world had been closed in by an invisible force. Their breath caught in their throat as they looked around. The trip back home was silent, uneventful, but the feeling that something was watching, waiting, followed them like a shadow. They sat in their room later that night, exhausted, but unable to sleep. The faint glow of their lantern flickered on their desk, untouched. The room was still, but there was something wrong with the quiet. As they sat there, their gaze fell on the corner of the room, where the shadow seemed to stretch and move in a way that no light could explain. Just a fleeting movement, but enough to make their heart race. With trembling hands, they reached for the lantern. As their fingers grazed the cold metal, a soft, breathless whisper filled the room. You're never alone. The voice was everywhere, inside their head, in their bones. The lantern flickered one last time before going out. The room was engulfed in total darkness, and somewhere, deep within that blackness, they could feel it, watching, waiting. If you dare, share this story. But remember, every retelling brings the darkness closer. Each word spoken makes it real. Are you sure the lights in your room are keeping the shadows out, or are they just waiting for you to notice them?